Gospel according to John, the 12th chapter. 6 days before the Passover, Jesus came to Bethany, the home of Lazarus, whom he had raised from the dead. There they gave a dinner for him. Martha served, and Lazarus was one of those at the table with him.
Mary took a pound of costly perfume made of pure nard. She anointed Jesus' feet and wiped them with her hair. The house was filled with the fragrance of the perfume.
But Judas Iscariot, one of his disciples, the one who was about to betray him, said, "Why was this perfume not sold for 300 denarii and the money given to the poor?" He said this not because he cared about the poor, but because he was a thief. He kept the common purse and used it to steal what was put into it.
Jesus said, "Leave her alone. She bought it so that she might keep it for the day of my burial. You always have the poor with you, but you do not always have me."
The Gospel of the Lord.
Praise to you, O Christ.
You may be seated. This morning I invited Denise Cortez to share the sermon time with me as we reflect on this reading from John 12. I've asked Denise because I think Denise is the best person in town that I know of that can help us understand Jesus' words today when he says to us, "The poor you will always have with you."
Thank you, Pastor Steve. It's always a great joy for me to worship with Ascension. Two of my favorite things about coming here are your Wednesday morning school chapel and your Holdren evening prayer. I greatly appreciate Ascension's partnership as together with our interfaith community and with our city, we serve the most vulnerable people in our community.
So Denise and I are going to reflect with Martin Luther's question, what does this mean? The last verse of our gospel reading when Jesus says to us, "The poor you will always have with you." This is the context in John's gospel. It's chapter 12. In the previous chapter 11, the long chapter 11, Mary and Martha's brother Lazarus died and was then raised by Jesus to life. In that chapter, Mary also anointed Jesus' feet with perfume, and later again she knelt at Jesus' feet. Then you all know chapter 13 in John's gospel. This is Maundy Thursday. And in John's gospel, it's the story of Jesus washing the disciples' feet, teaching us about what it means to be a servant, a follower of his. And in John's gospel, for who Jesus is, this is the Word became flesh. This is the great I am. And later in John's gospel, we hear from Thomas say to us that Jesus is Lord and God. This is the one who receives the extravagant servant love of Mary with the expensive perfume. The anointing of oil in the Hebrew Scriptures was for kings. The Hebrew word for anointed is Messiah. The Greek word for anointed is Christ. And here in this chapter, Jesus is also being anointed for his burial. So there's lots of powerful symbolism and foreshadowing that's going on in the telling of this story.
Yes, and in John's gospel, it's Judas who criticizes Mary, saying that the perfume could have been sold for a lot of money and given to the poor. But John tells us parenthetically that Judas said this, not because he cared 2 cents for the poor, but because he was actually a thief. And then we hear Jesus say, "Leave her alone. She bought it for my burial. You always have the poor with you, but you will not always have me."
So what does this mean, that you will always have the poor with you? Denise, no doubt in all of your years of working with the poor in our community, you've heard that verse often. I'm sure you've reflected on what that means. And I think we've all heard that verse interpreted in wrong ways many times. What do you think?
Yes, I do. I think we do interpret it wrongly. I think sometimes we see this verse as a great excuse. It almost sounds like even Jesus is throwing up his hands and giving us an excuse to do nothing. That surely there are more important things we should focus on.
So what's a better way to interpret that verse?
I think Jesus meant this verse very differently. I think he was saying, if you want to follow me, if you really want to be my disciples, you will always be near the poor. This is where God's people are. We're always among the poor. And if we choose to follow him, we will always know the poor. Father Greg Boyle from Homeboy Industries says, this verse is not about policy, it's about proximity. Disciples erase the margins if we stand there with the poor, if we stand with the powerless and those whose burdens are more than they can bear.
I believe that too, and I know that you and I both want to share this with the congregation and with all those who are watching live stream on Facebook, that when Jesus says this, he's actually quoting a verse in Deuteronomy 15. Jesus and his disciples, as faithful Jews, knew the Torah so well that they would immediately know the context of what Jesus is saying. They knew Deuteronomy 15, and they would know what Jesus meant when he told them the poor would always be with you. And so listen to the context of that as Denise reads some verses from Deuteronomy 15.
If there is among you anyone in need, a member of your community in any of your towns within the land that the Lord your God is giving you, do not be hard-hearted or tight-fisted toward your needy neighbor. You should rather open your hand, willingly lending enough to meet the need. Whatever it might be, give liberally and ungrudgingly when you do so, for on this account the Lord your God will bless you in all your work and in all that you undertake. Since there will never cease to be some in need on the earth, I therefore command you, open your hand to the poor and needy neighbor in your land. So Jesus is quoting the first half of Deuteronomy 15:11. There will never cease to be some in need on the earth. And the disciples then, and we are to remember the second half of verse 11. I therefore command you, God says, open your hand to the poor and the needy neighbor in your land. Denise, this is what your ministry is all about in our community. And I know that you and Karen Getchoff here recently left your positions with Lutheran Social Services to begin a new ministry, a new 501c3 called Harbor House. Could you tell us about that transition and what's your vision for this new ministry at Harbor House? Absolutely. I was with Lutheran Social Service, as was Karen. I was there for 4 years, and I will tell you that we worked very hard. With the central office of Lutheran Social Service being in Orange County, we were sharing our donations that we brought in with the corporate office. This also meant that the decision-making was diluted, because people who do not know the local poor were making the decisions about who we could help and who we couldn't. The people in our community, especially those who sit in our pews, made it very clear to me repeatedly that they want to donate to those who are in need right here in our community, in our own neighborhood. All of the local poor know the pastors at Ascension, and all of our pastors here know them. As for my vision for Harbor House, that's very simple. Last month, I was outreaching with our local police. We went to a local motel in Newbury Park, and the reason we did that was that we were trying to get accurate numbers of homeless families with children living in motels. On that night, I met 13 children who were living in one small motel. One of them was a beautiful 10-year-old girl. We stood at the door of their motel room for quite some time, and we learned a lot about them. The parents each work a minimum wage job every day. The 2 girls go to local schools. And the little girl told me, do you know I was born at the county hospital in Ventura 10 years ago, and my parents brought me home from the hospital to this room, and I have lived here every day since. My vision, Pastor Steve, my hope for Harbor House is that every child in this community will have a place to call home, however small, however humble, a place that they will always know as their home.
That sounds excellent. Thank you. And I know that Harbor House has already received tremendous support from our community, from the police, from the interfaith community. And tell us about some of that support.
Pastor Steve, we've been so blessed. The city of Thousand Oaks jumped right in with us from the very moment that I shared the idea with them of a local nonprofit. They have already given us a small donation that they called seed money. We're very, very grateful. The city has also given us many resources and helped us to find office space. The city gives us the opportunity every day to work with our local police. Our police chief here in Thousand Oaks is a big supporter of the work that we do. He also knows the poor by name. And Thousand Oaks is fortunate to have 2 full-time vulnerable populations officers. They work with us every day to serve the homeless in the community. Working together with the police on these issues is a great opportunity for us to serve more people in more meaningful ways, because the police provide more clout and respect because everyone listens to the police. And we can provide the police with valuable information about poverty and social services. So we make a good team.
Ascension is a part of that, and we look forward to the work together. And it's our interfaith community that started and still leads the meal and the shelter program that happens each evening at a different house of faith. And let's hear an update about that ministry.
Over 20 years ago, a lot of people don't know this, over 20 years ago, some very special leaders in this community from several different houses of faith got together, and they decided to provide a daily meal for the homeless. Eventually, that daily meal became a shelter during the winter months. Today, we have over 15 churches and synagogues and many more businesses. We now have more than 700 volunteers that make this amazing meal and shelter work. It is real evidence of the kind and caring community that we live in. People here really, really care about the poor, and that makes this a wonderful kind of community for me to live in.
I remember one time a few years ago when I was in your office, and I shared with you this good quote from a famous theologian from Peru. He's still living. He's 91 years old. His name is Father Gustavo Gutierrez, and he said this: "You say you love the poor. Name them." I know in your daily work and with your staff and the volunteers, this is of utmost importance. On March 22nd, when my life group served the meal at the Methodist Church, I talked with volunteer Liz Hoskinson, who always greets people at the door there. And she's a member of the Methodist Church, and Liz, as many of you know, is also a teacher in our early childhood center here. She told me how important it is for her to know each person's name who comes through the door. And as I watched her and greeted people, she did know each person's name. Our own Pastor Ken Caudill, who shares the table prayer with the group each fourth Friday of the month, likes to greet each person by name before they receive their meal. Brenda and Chuck Heinrich, who coordinate this ministry for Community Concerns Committee, believes this too. Names are so important, each person's name. Denise, as you're able to, I know without saying names, but tell us some real-life stories of people that you've been working with.
Their names are so important to us, and their stories are powerful for sure. We currently have a young man who just turned 30 this year. He was born in New York, and when he was 3 years old, his mother died, and he was immediately put into foster care. But later on, his foster mother wanted to give him up when he turned 12. She said she would no longer get any money from the state for keeping him, so she told him he had to go. She told him she needed to foster a young child so that she could get money for fostering. He asked, couldn't he just stay also? And she said she wouldn't qualify as a foster parent if there were another child there. To this day, I do not know if the story that he was told was really true, or if maybe he was just too difficult for her to handle. But what I do know is this, that in all my life, I've never met a person or a child that felt more unwanted than this young man feels, and still feels today. We have another client who came to us very afraid, very skittish, almost afraid to talk to me about her circumstances. She started out by telling me she'd lived a terrible childhood. She said her mom was a drug addict, and her mom sold her for a few hours to her own drug dealer every week when he came by the motel that they lived in. This mother traded her daughter's innocence for a bag of meth. This beautiful young woman says she doesn't know how she will ever learn to trust people again. Some of our most difficult stories these days, though, are older people, women mostly. These women did not earn enough money during their lifetime to qualify for a decent Social Security. Maybe they've lost a husband to death or divorce for whatever reasons, and we don't know them all. They did not plan. They just did not plan on their life turning out as it has. In some cases, we often wonder if they planned at all. How they got in this situation, though, is a very small matter to us in light of their devastating circumstances. Being 70 or 75 years old, living out your later years sleeping in your car, and eating nightly at the homeless dinner is surely not what these fragile women planned for their future.
One of the women that we've been working with for a number of years who is homeless, she's a widow. I think one of you here in the congregation actually donated the vehicle for her van. She's currently in a nursing home. If any of you would like to just be a friend and run some errands for her, we can help you to do that. My last question for you is, what is it then that motivates you to do this kind of work, this service in our community?
Pastor Steve, from the time that I was a little girl, the gospel has captivated me. I have read it and prayed it over and over and over again. I didn't ever do that, reading or praying, because I was good or holy, but because I had never read anything quite like it. I believed every word I read. I wanted to know this Jesus. I wanted to know his mind, and I wanted to know his heart. Our youngest son was home for dinner last night, and I asked him, actually Friday night, because we did this last night, I said, Pastor Steve's going to ask me a funny question in church tomorrow in front of the congregation. He's going to ask me, why do you do the work you do? And my son laughed. And he told me that when he was young, he asked me a similar question, although I'm sure he didn't ask it so kindly. It was more like, Mom, why do you do these weird things? He said he remembered that the gospel story I read to him was a story of Jesus touching the leper. He said that when we were finished reading the gospel story, that I told him the 5 most important words in that gospel were Jesus was moved with pity. Jesus was moved with pity. When I hear the stories of our fragile people, I know with absolute certainty that Jesus is moved with pity.
So we want to thank you, Denise and Karen, and your team that you're developing here, and the many volunteers who will be part of Harbor House, for your partnership in the gospel of Jesus Christ. And you and your ministry reminds me of this verse from Galatians 2:10 that I'd like all of us to read together. We want to say, with the Apostle Paul, only they asked us to remember the poor, the very thing I was eager to do. With Jesus leading us, we are eager to remember the poor. When Jesus says, you will always have the poor among you, this means to me that if the church will truly be what the church is called to be, the poor will be in our midst, will always be in our midst because of Jesus knowing each one of them by name, loving them with an everlasting love as he does with each one of us. It means to open our hand to the poor and needy neighbor in our community as God leads us to all the needy in God's beloved world. This morning we put an insert in your bulletin, the color insert. On one side lists the ministries of our Community Concerns Committee, the local ministries. The other side lists the global ministries, and many of those ministries on both sides care for the most vulnerable people locally and globally. And if you have any questions about that, we invite you to ask us about some of those ministries and be part of them. Today, we can be a part of one of them in a special way with the fair trade sales, because that's very important ways that we help farmers around the world. Thank you, Denise, for being with us. And all God's people said, amen.